What's up, investors? Here's the Russian dude. Mobile internet shutdowns and so-called white lists have finally reached Moscow. And if you wanted one perfect symbol of how the war is no longer staying somewhere far away from Russia's comfortable capital life, well, this is it. Because for years the Kremlin told people that everything was normal, everything was stable, under control, as their favorite saying. While ordinary Russians could keep going to work, ordering food, calling taxis, scrolling through Telegram, using maps, paying through apps, and just in general pretending that the consequences belonged somewhere else, some different city, somewhere in Kursk, Belgrade, Bryansk, rural Tiva maybe, or on some distant television map where reality was safely outsourced. But, well, this time is over. Because now, when Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, was asked how long these shutdowns that are currently being implemented across Russia would last, he called them legal and said that they would remain in place for as long as security concerns were being addressed. Which basically means, as you could expect, that, well, nobody's giving you a deadline, nobody's calming you down, and the largest cities in Russia may simply have to accept that now mobile internet can disappear whenever the states decide that security requires it. And that is the real story here, because the Kremlin spent years trying to normalize the war and also isolate ordinary people from its consequences. But now the very same government is damaging critical infrastructure inside its own capital, on a scale that not even Ukrainian drones and missiles could not even achieve by themselves. And it is doing so not to just some foreign platform, not to a military target even, but to its own population. Let's talk about all of this in today's episode. So here is where things get truly interesting, because the Kremlin narrative was built around one quiet promise. Yes, something is happening somewhere, yes, there are maps, arrows, red lines, briefings, slogans, contracts, patriotic speeches, but if you live in a major Russian city, especially Moscow or St. Petersburg, your personal life will not, well, really, quote-unquote, change. The war could be visible, yes, in Kursk, Belgrade, Bryansk, once again rural Tiva, and in poorer regions men could be pushed or tempted into signing military contracts, but Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Ekaterinburg and other cities with the population above 1 million were supposed to remain inside this so-called bubble, where the war was not just lived experience, but just a background noise from TV, from radio and telegram channels. And now, well, the government is trapped by its own story, because if there was supposedly no real emergency, if everything is supposedly going according to the so-called plan, and if Moscow is supposedly safe, stable and untouched, then why exactly is the state taking out mobile internet in its own capital? For years people were told not to panic, not to ask too many questions, and not to behave as their country was some kind of in a crisis. But now the very same authorities are taking emergency-style measures that do not match the official mood they have been selling since 2022. Except now Telegram itself is being targeted, as we all know, mobile internet is being restricted, white lists are being introduced, and many pro-war voices that spent years defending every decision from above, so suddenly look confused, because the machine they uploaded has finally walked into their own daily lives and incomes and started unplugging their lifelines. That is why these shutdowns feel different from ordinary censorship, because censorship can still be sold to loyal audiences as a weapon against bad information, while mobile internet interruptions hit people trying to just simply use maps, pay for groceries, send messages, order taxis, or just in general keep even small businesses running. Moscow was not supposed to feel touched by the war. Moscow was supposed to feel like the capital of a country that had successfully pushed the consequences onto somebody else, somewhere else. And once that illusion begins to crack, the next question becomes much more uncomfortable and obvious. Well, to be honest, if you think about it, maybe not as uncomfortable and cringy as some episodes of ridiculous Russian propaganda, but uncomfortable nevertheless. And by the way, speaking about ridiculous Russian propaganda, an additional Patreon chapter, exclusive chapter, will be just about that. So if you want to get access to that additional content, watch these episodes 6 hours before they go live on YouTube, and just in general support the channel in the best way possible, please go ahead and make sure to check the Patreon link, which is down below. Thanks so much. Now let's continue. Now here's the major catch. This may be one of the first times the Russian government has barged into the daily lives of a huge share of citizens and then struggled to blame the intrusion on some clear external actor. In 2014, for example, when Russia rolled out anti-sanctions that hit the food industry, propaganda still managed to sugarcoat the story, and many Russians were convinced that Europeans had somehow deprived them of dry-cured ham, Parmesan cheese, figs, and other important imported products, even though the Russian authorities played a direct, if not sole role in that spectacle. Later on in 2022, after the full-scale invasion, Russians faced the collapse of normal air travel options, the withdrawal of Visa and MasterCard, and the disappearance of many foreign car brands from the market, except for the Chinese ones. But even then, the Kremlin could point outward and blame sanctions and Western corporate decisions. For example, when YouTube loading speeds were slowed down significantly until it was not even possible to watch these videos on YouTube at all, propaganda tried to blame Google's supposed unwillingness to update its servers. And during the 2022 mobilization drive, the authorities insisted that normal life would continue and only about just 1% of Russian population men will be involved. But this time, the package is not wrapped properly, because the government is simply interfering with basic infrastructure and saying, this, guys, is legal, this is necessary, and you will tolerate it until we decide otherwise. The possible explanation is almost too absurd to be funny, because after watching the crisis in Iran in 2026, after seeing how centralized, security-heavy dictatorship could suddenly find itself exposed and forced into emergency behavior, the Kremlin appears to have absorbed the lesson in the most paranoid way imaginable. Instead of thinking that societies become unstable when rulers close every single legal valve and treat the population like a suspicious crowd, the Kremlin seems to have concluded that the real danger is now technology, communication, and the ability itself of people to coordinate, record, share, and react. Iran, that we mentioned previously, matters, because among the major crises of 2026, it looked awfully familiar to Moscow's point of view. A strongman-style system, powerful security agencies, harsh repressions, and then just a chain of failures that made the authorities look far less invisible than they appeared on paper. Venezuela, another crisis by comparison, looked more like a just surgical operation. And the Russian government has not yet reached the point where Putin could simply be physically removed from the chessboard in that kind of way, if ever, unfortunately. But Iran's, on the other hand, story is much closer to the nightmare Russian officials actually fear. A regime that thinks it sees everything misses the eruption of anger. A security state that thinks it controls everyone discovers that control is not omnipresent. And a leadership that believes it can rule forever suddenly has to behave almost like an underground organization inside its own country. So basically, once a ruler has to hide, the image of control is already damaged, loyalty becomes less like fate and more like a risk calculation, and paranoia starts confusing communication itself with rebellion. So yes, it may sound unbelievably blunt and straight to the point, but the Kremlin appears to be reacting to fear by destabilizing the one thing every citizen uses every single day. And once ordinary internet access becomes suspicious, VPNs become an even bigger target. Let's talk about them in our next chapter. Now, this detail changes everything, because while mobile internet shutdowns show how scared the state has become, the plan to charge extra money for VPN-related traffic shows something even more cynical. The Kremlin does not only want to punish people for bypassing restrictions, it also wants to squeeze additional money out of them while doing it. According to Vedomosti, Russian mobile operators were not technically ready to introduce fees on VPN-related traffic from May 1st, even though we still have a couple of days until that date, because their billing systems could not yet track, classify, and charge that usage in real time, which already tells you that how just rushed and chaotic this campaign has become. The idea was that pretty much mobile operators would introduce additional charges for international traffic exceeding 15 gigabytes per month, as just a part of a wider campaign against VPN services, while sources cited by BBC Russian service said that users could be charged an average of 150 rubles, or approximately $2-3 per gigabyte above the limit. Just think about the logic here. The government blocks or restricts access to information. People use VPNs to reach and read what was blocked. And then the state tries to turn that attempt into a paid penalty system, where punishment arrives quietly through just a telecom bill. First of all, it punishes people for using VPNs to access restricted information inside Russia, because if the Kremlin cannot fully stop the habit overnight, it can make the habit just expensive, annoying, unpredictable, risky and costly. Second, it creates another way to extract money from the public at a time when the war constantly needs new resources, and when the state has already leaned so heavily on inflation, taxes, fees, shrinking choices, and indirect pressure to keep the machine running. But the technical problems are enormous. One source told Vedomosti it would take until autumn-fall to rework billing systems, while another said that operators had asked for a few months to revise tariff plans and soften the impact on consumers. And then the Digital Development Ministry could said reportedly delay the implementation until even September 1st or even as early as 2028. That delay is not because the authorities suddenly discovered digital freedom. It is because turning censorship into a functioning billing product is technically messy, especially when nobody can clearly explain what counts even this as international traffic. Because some Russian companies even do rely on foreign IP addresses, while content delivery networks operated inside Russia by companies such as Google can localize traffic and then further complicate classification even more. Operators also reportedly lack clear guidance on what happens when users exceed this 15 GB threshold without paying. Whether speed should be slowed down, funds should be automatically deducted, or just internet access should be cut off entirely. Konstantin Ankilov, the head of the TMT Consulting, told Vedomosti that implementing the system would require tracking traffic for about 180 million users, pretty much the entire population of Russia and more, and then rewriting tariff structures, while then independent analyst Alexei Boyko then, in return, said that changes of this kind typically take months and sometimes even half a year at least. Then we have Digital Development Minister Maksut Shadayev said that in late March that reducing VPN usage had become a priority for his ministry, and as part of the same push, operators were ordered from April 1st to stop allowing Apple ID top-ups through mobile accounts, limiting one common way of paying for VPN services. At the same time, the ministry has moved to revoke accreditation from IT companies that allow access to their services through VPNs, and to remove such services from white lists that permit access even during shutdowns. Next we have Forbes Russia sources that said that the push followed by a confidential order from Vladimir Putin himself, though the Kremlin claimed it knew absolutely nothing about such document, as always, which is exactly the kind of denial that tells you that the system wants both total control and total deniability, while approving and just pretty much confirming something what they have denied previously. And this is why the VPN story matters so much, because the Kremlin is not simply building a wall around information, it is trying to charge people for looking for the door. And once bypassing censorship becomes both politically suspicious and financially taxable, the internet stops being just a service and becomes the battlefield, the endless fight between the Kremlin and its biggest enemy. Now here is the game changer. The Russian state is targeting the internet because it is one of the few enemies it can actually hit without immediately facing an opponent it cannot control. The war against Ukraine is in its 5th year. The Kiev government is still standing. Ukraine is improving its sabotage, long-range strikes, and reconnaissance capabilities. And the Kremlin cannot simply declare a war against, United States, it's supposedly another big enemy, because Washington still occupies an almost mythical place in the Russian security imagination. So, as a result, it reaches for the target within reach. Internet infrastructure, communications, mobile access, VPNs, Telegram, whitelist, Apple ID payments, IT accreditation, and basically, as you can see, anything else that can be regulated, slowed down, built, blocked or blamed. From the security apparatus's point of view, this creates the appearance of action, because they can tell the boss, the one and only, that they are ensuring safety, closing vulnerabilities, reducing exposure, and taking firm measures with no regard for public sentiment. The logic of the security apparatus is detached from political and economic reality, however, because the FSB and related structures are not primarily thinking about taxi rides, small businesses, online payments, public mood, consumer frustration, or even Moscow's reputation as a modern city, because their job is to solely guard the system. And if the political or economic damage becomes ugly, then domestic policy strategists, financial authorities, telecom operators, or even the Moscow's mayor's office itself can deal with the mess later. This is what makes this pro-war government reaction so fascinating. Because the moment normal communication was disrupted, some of the very same people who defended the Iron Fist began sounding almost like the people they used to mock. What a turn of event, how tables turned, right? And suddenly, legal limits do not seem so useless, political institutions do not sound like just decorative nonsense, and the idea that unchecked personalist rule can damage the things people actually like about their country becomes practical observation, not an opposition slogan. The Russian state used to brag about fast internet, digital services, banking app superiority, navigation, delivery, payment systems, and just in general convenience of urban life. And now, to protect the personalist system, it is ready to damage the very accomplishments it once used as a proof that everything was modern and efficient. That realization is arriving when someone cannot load a map, order a taxi, pay normally, message normally, work smoothly, or just simply understand why their city suddenly feels like someone just pulled a wire out of the wall. Because in a society where many people can ignore politics for years, the internet is not politics in their mind anymore. It is the wallet, it is the workplace, family chat, delivery service, bank branch, the map, ticket office, and just emergency tool compressed all into one invisible layer that everyone expects to function at least somehow. Taking this away to protect someone from real or even imaginary, most likely even imaginary threats, feels less like a security and more like a punishment. And once punishment becomes universal, even loyal people start asking questions they were not supposed to ask. That is precisely how red lines that were thought non-existent before are being crossed right now. Here's the part that surprised me the most. Huge losses in this war eventually stopped shocking many inside Russia. But the moment people cannot order taxi, pay for purchase, place online order, or message someone normally, suddenly everyone remembers words like rights and freedom and common sense. That's unfortunate, but well, it is what it is. This is what happens in a depoliticized society, where the majority does not see the war as their own project, but as some obscure government operation that the state is handling with its own money, contracts, slogans, and just vague historical goals. If somebody wants to join that project, quote-unquote, war pretty much, for 3 million rubles, well, fine, that is their decision. And if somebody does not want to put their life at risk for this same money, 3 million rubles, that's it, they can ignore it, nobody's forcing them. The war's effects have been building for years, but they have arrived unevenly. Inflation here, tax hikes, there are shortages in one category, worse travel routes in another, fewer foreign brands, more Chinese cars, more expensive services, and just in general fewer options that used to feel normal. Most Russians do not care if a trip to Paris now requires flying through Istanbul, because most Russians do not even have an international travel passport. And many then do not care about missing European cheese, foreign cars, or Western payment systems enough to reconsider the entire political structure. But every single person, almost everyone uses the internet. It is used by the young, the old, the loyal and the skeptical, the apolitical and the propagandized, the Moscow office worker and the provincial shop owner, the delivery driver and the student trying to finish the assignment and upload paperwork, the pensioner calling family, and even the business owner trying to just keep payments moving so that they can pay taxes to the Russian state itself. That is why the backlash was so predictable, because a dictatorship can survive abstract anger as long as most people experience politics as something happening to others. But it takes a real risk when it starts messing with the daily mechanics of private life. The unspoken deal was, once again, very simple. Don't interfere with us, and we will not interfere too much with you. But now the government is interfering. It interfered during mobilization, when people realized that the state wanted direct participation in its war, not just passive applause from the sofas. And then panic spread so quickly that the mobilization drive had to be winded down at the height of national anxiety. And now the very same pattern is appearing once again. Only this time, the battlefield is not the enlistment office, but the phone screen. People who did not want to discuss institutions are now discussing limits. People who did not care about censorship are now discovering that censorship can become a monthly bill. And people who shrugged at propaganda now do care because the state has touched their map. They touched their messengers, bank payment apps, works, routines, everything. The Kremlin used to understand which lines were way too dangerous to cross, but now it is so frightened by rebellions, protests, foreign interference or foreign intelligence, domestic disloyalty, and technological networks that it is now crossing them voluntarily itself. And in trying to prevent the instability, it is creating the kind of shared inconvenience that can turn private frustration into public emotion. Guys, if you found this video essay interesting, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much, see you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.